everybody. We're coming on the air with a jobs report that is shattering expectations right now. More than twice as many jobs added last month than what was expected. Unemployment back to pre-pandemic levels. But as we're always talking about on this show, the economy is a lot more complicated than that. Why these numbers could actually lead to higher interest rates. We're going to talk about that coming up. Plus, with Brittney Griner's sentence now known, Russia's saying it's ready to talk about a prisoner swap for her and Paul Whelan. The U.S. has said it's going to play ball. Will it be for the terms they've already laid out? And the president's heading to Kentucky on Monday to see the damage from the deadly flooding. This after a lightning disaster outside of the White House. We have got the forecast on yet another round of intense heat coming up this weekend. Plus, we're back inside the metaverse tonight with how people are trying to bring activism to the virtual world. That's in The Original. And as more and more folks embrace streaming, the CEO of Warner Brothers Discovery is saying, wait, not so fast. Why they want to bring movies back to the theaters later on in the show. Hey, everybody, I'm Yasmin in for Hallie. And today we're processing yet another piece of this complicated state of the economy after a new jobs report that absolutely blew away the expectations of most experts by almost double, by the way. I want to look at the numbers here. Last month, the U.S. added 528,000 jobs, as you see right there. The experts thought that it'd be somewhere around 250,000, and that's with an unemployment rate of 3.5%. And then there's a big gains in a bunch of different sectors. You got leisure, healthcare, construction as well. And if you want a job, there's a good chance you can get one. There's now nearly 2 openings for every unemployed person, and President Biden's clearly taken a victory lap on all of this news. But as good as all of that sounds, as with everything with this economy, there is a catch to it, because these jobs numbers are so good that might actually convince Fed Chair Jerome Powell that he can actually raise interest rates yet again. They've already been climbing 2.25% this year, which raises costs for things like credit cards, which I'm sure many of you know, mortgages if you're trying to buy a house, car and student loans as well. And then there is how much you're actually getting paid. Sure, hourly wages, they are up 5.2% in July. That's pretty good, right? But it's not meeting inflation right now, 9.1% in June. On Wednesday, we're going to get a better idea of just how much more everything is actually costing. So let's talk through some of this stuff, or all of it, I should say, with Jake Ward, who's going to break it down for us, or try to. Jake, as always, it's good to talk to you. So listen, you got these really fantastic jobs numbers out, right? Once again, overperforming, unemployment down to pre-pandemic levels as well. But then I talk about how this could actually lead to higher interest rates, trying to slow the economy even more. Talk about that decision.
Well, Yasmin, you mentioned it. I'm going to try to explain it because, boy, it is so complicated. But the big picture, the headline here, is that according to these unemployment numbers, the pandemic is in the rearview mirror. We are essentially done with it because we're back to unemployment rates and job creation rates that are the equal of February 2020. And that means that we're in a very good picture. Really, we're looking in the rearview mirror at the pandemic. But we're not sure where all of this is headed, and things are very strange. We spoke to the chief economist of Glassdoor about this moment that we are in, and whether returning to normal is the way to describe this. Here's how he talked about it.
We aren't going back to the labor market that we had before the pandemic. We can get to the unemployment rate. We can get to the payroll employment level that we had before the pandemic. But the fact is that we are in a new normal. The labor market today looks very different from the labor market of the past. And in some ways, that's very positive.
And why we want this to all be good news, and it is good news on the face of it, but things are so strange coming out of the pandemic. It's just not entirely clear where things are headed yet, Yasmin.
So we looked at some of the places where things are looking pretty good right now. You got leisure, healthcare, construction as well, right? But there's some areas where things are not doing as well, Jake. If you could talk through some of that. We're talking about finance and tech.
That's right. So where I'm standing in the Bay Area, right, you could conceivably get a job at any one of those sectors that you had on the screen a moment ago, right? If you want to work in a hotel, you want to work at one of these restaurants that's coming back, you can have a job in those. But if you want a job in tech, harder to come by than it has been in a long time. You know, we're talking right now at more than 30,000 people in tech laid off this year alone as those companies prepare for tough times ahead. And then there's finance, right? The big banks are preparing to lay people off if they haven't laid them off already, and that is because they hired all kinds of people to deal with the incredible explosion in IPOs and the incredible explosion in people refinancing their homes, taking out mortgages to buy homes. All of that was an incredible economic engine there for a while. That seems to be over. So whether the banks and tech know something that we don't is the thing that remains to be seen here, yes.
Talk to me about recession, right? So I guess we learned today we're not in one because there has been a lot of back and forth as to whether actually we're even in a recession right now. But the question is, are we headed towards one? Do we know the answer to that question yet?
You know, we just don't. On the face of it, we're not going into a recession if history is any guide, because we've really almost never had an instance in which we went into a recession with a labor market as incredibly hot as this. Yeah. On the other hand, we've never had, you know, the pandemic is a once-in-a-lifetime experience, right? That is an incredibly weird once-in-a-lifetime thing. And so we're not sure if history is the proper guide here. And so while everything looks good on its face, you have every major economic, analyst, the National Bureau of Economic Research, which could declare whether this is a recession. They're all changing their definitions on the fly because things were so weird coming out of the pandemic. So I want to stand here and say it's all over and we're good. Yeah. It's not entirely clear yet. But as of today, we're not in a recession, and everybody's feeling very relieved about these numbers today, Yasmin.
Jake Ward, you did good. You did good explaining it and talking us through it, so we appreciate it. I know it's a tough one, but thank you. Good to talk to you. All right, so we're talking a lot about inflation here, as we have for quite some time. Let's talk about the Inflation Reduction Act. The House is going to come back next Friday to vote on it after what is expected to be a long weekend in the Senate for Democrats to get this major health care and the spending package across the finish line. So the good news for them, everybody is on board, it seems. Here's Majority Leader Chuck Schumer talking about that.
Inflation Reduction Act is a life-saving, job-creating, cost-reducing bill. It's what the American people want. It's what the country so desperately needs. And it's what Democrats will deliver on in the coming days.
So here's why the one holdout, Arizona's Kyrsten Sinema, is now okay with it. They're making changes that she wanted to the tax rules, along with money that she wanted to fight droughts as well. Scott Wong is for us on Capitol Hill on this. So let's start with kind of the ABCs here, if we could, Scott, and that is kind of talking us through some of the changes that Kyrsten Sinema has asked for, specifically when it comes to the tax differences between the old version versus the new one.
That's right. The bulk of these changes, Yasmin, really does have to do with some of these tweaks to the tax reform portion of this package. Let's put up on the screen some of these changes. The first one, obviously, is a carried interest tax loophole. Kyrsten Sinema was able to preserve this loophole that essentially helps hedge fund managers, private equity managers, pay less in taxes. Secondly, another way to think about it is changes to the minimum corporate tax. She was able to remove something called accelerated depreciation that business owners in Arizona had raised concerns about to her. And thirdly, they are adding in a new excise tax on stock buybacks. The reason why that's significant is Chuck Schumer says that's going to raise $74 billion. That is 5 times as much as what the carried interest provision was going to raise. And so Schumer is actually saying, according to these changes by Sinema, they are actually going to reduce the deficit even more than they would have under the original package. We also learned just a few minutes ago that the drought portion of what Sinema was demanding, money for drought prevention, will be $4 billion. We didn't quite know the number. Now we know it's $4 billion for states in the West, including her own Arizona.
Look what you can get done when you are the alone standout senator and everything hinges on you, Scott Wong. Hey, talk to me, though, about this loophole, right? Because, correct me if I'm wrong, but Manchin really wanted to close this loophole. And so are we sure everybody is on board, Manchin is on board with these changes?
Well, that's interesting, Yasmin. We haven't heard today from Joe Manchin himself. However, you played a clip from Senator Schumer just a minute ago where he basically said that he had been speaking to all of his members throughout this week. That's his job, right, as majority leader, checking in with all of his members, seeing where they're at, seeing what they're comfortable with. And according to him today, he told reporters that he believes he will have all 50 Democrats on board. The reason that's important is they need to hold that fragile coalition together because no Republican's going to support this thing. They need all 50 Democrats, Kyrsten Sinema, Joe Manchin. They're going to need help from Kamala Harris to come in as well to break the tiebreaker with Republicans.
So two more questions. One quick for you. Everyone healthy at this point? Because that's also important when it comes to COVID, of course. They can't vote if they're not healthy, if they're in quarantine, A. And B, what's the weekend going to look like with this?
So far, everyone is healthy. Jeff Merkley of Oregon did have to fly back to Oregon this week to be with his ailing mother. He is supposed to be back in the Capitol tomorrow. In terms of what this weekend looks like, it is a rare weekend session. They're going to kick off a key procedural vote tomorrow afternoon on this reconciliation package. Republicans are saying they're going to make this as painful as possible, up to 20 hours of debate, a round-robin vote-a-rama on amendments that will be mostly Republican amendments. Here's Lindsey Graham talking about some of the pain they plan to inflict on the Democrats.
I would just say this to my Democratic colleagues. To Manchin and Sinema, thank you for holding the line on the Senate filibuster. Thank you for doing some things to make America a less radical place. But you are going to be held accountable by your voters on this issue.
And so Republicans are going to try to do all sorts of delay tactics, Yasmin, but at the end of the day, Democrats, it appears, do have the votes to pass this. They're going to send this over to the House of Representatives. You mentioned they're going to take this up a week from today and send this to President Joe Biden's desk.
Scott Wong for us. Thank you. Good to talk to you. Have a good weekend, my friend. All right. Russia's saying today it's ready to discuss a prisoner swap with the United States now that WNBA star Brittney Griner has been sentenced to 9.5 years in prison. This afternoon, the president said that he is hopeful and that the United States is working hard to get her home. Meanwhile, Russia's foreign minister saying today those talks will have to go through an existing diplomatic channel. Griner was convicted and sentenced yesterday for carrying less than a gram of cannabis oil through a Moscow airport. This whole ordeal has certainly raised some questions that she's being used really as a political pawn in Russia's war against Ukraine. A potential prisoner swap could actually involve Griner and Paul Whelan as well, an American who was convicted on spying charges. The United States could release a convicted Russian arms dealer. Want to bring in Molly Hunter to talk more about today's developments and the possibility they could actually get something done. Molly, as always, it's good to talk to you. So Moscow now saying willing to talk, right? But Russian officials warning against discussing the potential swap in public. Why is that? And what do we know about where negotiations stand right now?
Hey, Yasmin, great to be with you. Yeah, I mean, I think we're getting into this period now where we know these negotiations will likely get going. We may hear a little bit from both sides, but we may not know the status of these. We may not be getting updates. Now, the reason we heard Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, come out today and say, look, we don't want these to be done in public. We want these to be done, by an established diplomatic channel that President Putin and President Biden had previously agreed on, is because last week the U.S. went slightly public with their offer. That Griner Whelan for Victor Bout, that Russian arms dealer you mentioned, that offer was out there, was on the table. Now, last week, the Russians countered kind of through a back channel, Yasmin, and that was seen as not serious from the U.S. side. So I think right now the U.S. is waiting for a serious, substantial offer, though, given what Sergei Lavrov said today, whether or not we find out about that counteroffer, whether or not that counteroffer kind of becomes public, I'm not sure how the next few days are going to go or exactly who's going to be talking to who at what level.
So I know that we just talked about the fact that they're wanting to keep this somewhat private when it comes to negotiations, although we do know Lavrov and Secretary Blinken were both in Cambodia today. Any news, any ideas whether or not they talked about this very thing?
Yeah, both in Cambodia, Yasmin, at the same summit, literally in the frame together at multiple points. They were not sitting far away from each other. The news and the information we have from the White House is that there were no direct talks between Secretary of State Blinken and Foreign Minister Lavrov. We do know the two of them talked a week ago, last Friday, on the phone. That was the highest level discussion about Brittney Griner, to our knowledge. But according to John Kirby, of course, the NSC spokesperson, the two did not speak. They both spoke to the press, so we already heard what Sergei Lavrov said. Blinken, I'm just going to read out, he spoke to reporters. He said, look, Moscow has suggested they are prepared to engage through channels we've established to talk about this. We will be pursuing that, he said. He also said, Yasmin, it puts a spotlight on our very significant concern with Russia's legal system and the Russian government's use of wrongful detentions to advance its own agenda, using individuals as political pawns. But at this point, you'd think, fairly convenient to have the two foreign ministers right there in the same room. But to our knowledge, there was no further discussion. Yeah, key phrase there, to our knowledge, maybe possibly a pull aside that we don't necessarily know about and would hope so, quite honestly. Molly Hunter, thanks so much, as always. And we may not know, this. Yeah, exactly. We may not know when those discussions start happening, I think, in coming weeks. Yeah, no, that's exactly it. These discussions may be happening. We're not going to get minute-by-minute updates on a prisoner swap negotiation.
Yeah, as much as we'd like to. Thank you, Molly. Appreciate it. All right, a meeting between Turkey's President Erdogan and Russian President Putin sparking some concern today that Russia actually may be trying to circumvent sanctions from the West by turning to some new trading partners. Erdogan and Putin meeting at the Black Sea resort of Sochi. Their second face-to-face conversation, by the way, in less than 3 weeks. The two are saying they hope their negotiations help kind of put forward the role, as they put it, that Turkey and Russia play in the region. Last month, Turkey and the UN helped broker a deal clearing the way for Ukraine to start shipping grain through ports in the Black Sea that had been blocked by Russia. And so far, the deal seems to be working pretty well. 3 more ships carrying thousands of tons of corn left Ukrainian ports today and are on their way to Turkey for inspection. I want to bring in Josh Letterman from the capital city of Kyiv to talk more about this. So listen, Josh, we know about Western sanctions on Russia and what they're doing to the country's economy right now. There are some concerns that I just mentioned that this meeting could be really this attempt to kind of strengthen these economic ties with a NATO member country who has not joined in on these sanctions. Talk more about that.
Well, we know that for months now, Yasmin, the United States, the European Union have been trying to push these holdout countries that have been reluctant to ramp up economic pressure and sanctions on Russia. Countries like China, like India, and like Turkey, a NATO member that's supposed to be part of the European club. They've been trying to join the EU for years now, and yet Turkey's government has been adamant that they don't plan to join any sanctions that are not UN sanctions, and even those they have been reluctant to impose, given the fact that Turkey is so reliant on Russia for energy and for its trading relationship. And by all accounts from the meeting today, it was a real love fest between President Erdogan and President Putin of Russia. In fact, we heard from President Putin in that meeting praising Turkey's leader for brokering that deal to get the grain out of Ukraine. And we also heard from President Erdogan saying that Russia has a special place, a special role to play on the world stage. And the Russian government is also saying that they agreed in that meeting for Turkey to be buying its energy from Russia in rubles as opposed to in dollars, which of course has been a key demand from Russia for months now as a result of the fact that they are essentially cut off from the Western financial system because of sanctions.
Talk to me more about this grain deal, right? Because I mentioned earlier that these latest shipments out of Ukraine, they seem to be going well, despite, of course, the continued shelling and fighting that is happening in the region. That obviously has not stopped. Ukraine, though, reportedly calling for the deal to be expanded beyond grain to things like metals. Tell us about that.
Well, this deal is limited to agricultural products, meaning those grain products that are so critically needed in parts of the world like North Africa, where they are fearing a famine because they haven't been able to get that grain that's trapped in Ukraine for months now. But now we're hearing from the deputy economy minister here in Ukraine saying, look, this is all about logistics. We figured out a way to get these ships out safely, to navigate through the mined waters of the Black Sea, to have Russia not attack them. If we can do it for grain, we should be able to do it for other exports, like steel, a critical Ukrainian export. The Ukrainians hoping that they'll be able to expand this so that they can start to have a real functioning economy again. But of course, there are no indications that the Russians at this point are willing to expand that deal.
And then finally, just talk more about the shelling that we are continuing to hear about, especially at this nuclear power plant, which is integral to power in Europe in general. And we know Russia also took over this plant. I believe it was back in early spring.
Yeah, what terrifying news today that apparently the nuclear power plant, the largest in Europe, was shelled 3 times today. It's a little unclear what happened because the Russians who control it, they say it was the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians say that's absolutely not true, that Russia shelled the plant, damaging a power center near one of the reactors, which has now been disconnected from the grid for safety. President Zelensky and Ukraine's foreign ministry now urging the international community to force Russia to give up control of that plant so that they can make sure it's safe, as the head of the UN's nuclear watchdog says that the situation at the plant is completely out of control, Yasmin.
Wow. All right, Josh Letterman for us. Thanks so much, Josh. As always, good to talk to you. All right, let's talk China for a moment. China's saying today that it's going to end cooperation with the United States on key issues, including military relations and climate change. This is coming in response to House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. Beijing is also imposing sanctions against her while Pelosi was in Japan, the last stop of her Asia tour. She said China would not be allowed to succeed in its efforts to isolate Taiwan. I want you to listen to this.
They may try to keep Taiwan from visiting or participating in other places, but they will not isolate Taiwan by preventing us to travel there.
Beijing launched a second day of military drills around Taiwan today, sending military vessels and aircraft across the unofficial median line in the Taiwan Strait that had served as a buffer zone. All right, let's talk now about the abortion battle here in the United States, happening specifically in Kentucky and Indiana. In Kentucky, a deadline just passed for the state's attorney general to respond to 2 abortion clinics that have asked the state Supreme Court to lift an order that stopped abortions. Earlier on this week, a court reinstated Kentucky's trigger law banning abortions. The court sided with Attorney General Daniel Cameron, allowing the laws to temporarily be enforced while the case is proceeding in the courts. Also today in Indiana, the House voting there to keep exceptions in cases of rape or incest in a bill that would ban nearly all abortions in the state. The Indiana proposal following the firestorm, of course, over a 10-year-old rape victim who traveled to the state from Ohio to end a pregnancy. The case gained national attention when an Indianapolis doctor said the child had to travel to Indiana because a new Ohio law banning nearly all abortions. Maggie Vespa is joining me now to talk more about this. Let's talk first, Maggie, good to talk to you, by the way. Let's talk first about Kentucky, right? The ACLU and Planned Parenthood, they have asked the state Supreme Court decision for a quick decision there. Walk us through where things stand right now.
Well, I think the first point that we want to highlight is you mentioned that 4:30 deadline for the state's attorney general, who has been the one pushing this ban, to respond to the latest decision. Again, that's coming up on an hour ago. We have not seen any notification, and our team is monitoring it, of a response from the attorney general. So at this point, a lot of lawmakers say, regardless of whether he responds or what the response is, what this highlights is that there is a dizzying back and forth going on in the state of Kentucky, and for Kentuckians to try to navigate about whether or not they can get an abortion in any myriad of circumstances. And so they say now all eyes are on November, because a lot of people up until this week had been following the battle in Kansas over that vote that people there had as to whether or not to amend their state's constitution and explicitly allow for abortion bans. Very similar amendment up for a vote in Kentucky in November.
Got it.
We saw that amendment fail in Kansas.
Yeah.
So now we'll be watching Kentucky in the coming months.
So let's talk Indiana here as well. well, could become the first in the nation to pass this new legislation restricting access to abortions since the overturn of Roe. But what seems to be happening in the state specifically is it's really dividing lawmakers, even some we're hearing in the Republican Party. Talk to us about this.
Right. One Republican was quoted as saying that if a version, sort of the most conservative version of this bill, were to pass, it would make Indiana the most pro-life state, or at least one of the most pro-life states in the country. And you highlighted one of the big ones that's gotten a lot of press. They wanted to remove basically all exceptions. Some Republicans did for rape or incest. That effort failed. There was also a lot of conversations about the idea of requiring women who were claiming to be raped to have gone to the police and filed an official report or sign a notarized affidavit alleging that attack. Those efforts also failed. So this bill, this latest version without those stipulations, now goes on to the Senate. We are expecting a vote today, but we can also very possibly expect similar arguments and battles over what we saw today between parties and within parties. The Republican governor has not committed to signing a bill just yet, saying it's dependent upon what ends up finally in the bill. But one Republican in the House in Indiana was quoted as saying if Indianans don't like the final version of this bill, they can vote in new lawmakers.
Wow.
Yasmin?
Maggie Vespa for us. Thank you, Maggie. All right, coming up, everybody, Israel launching deadly airstrikes on Gaza and saying it was targeting Islamic Jihad militants. That is one of our 5 things tonight. And then later on, New York State's top health officials saying there could be hundreds of people infected with polio, where they're finding the virus. Stay with us. All right, so the jury in the defamation trial of Alex Jones now in a different phase in the conspiracy theorist trial. They're deliberating whether Jones has to pay punitive damages to the parents of a first grader who was killed during the Sandy Hook shooting. Punitive damages are awarded based on punishing a defendant. The parents' attorney in a final statement today asked the jury to take an amount that punishes Jones and that ensures he never does this again. A few hours ago, the jury heard from an economist who said Jones and his company are worth up to, get this, $270 million. Last night, the jury ordered Jones to pay $4.1 million in compensatory damages to make up for the injury they say he committed when falsely claiming the mass shooting was a hoax. Jones was not in the courtroom for yesterday's decision, but did respond later on InfoWars. And here's some of what he had to say.
I admitted I made a mistake. I admitted that I followed disinformation, but not on purpose. I apologized to the families. And the jury understood that. What I did to those families was wrong, but I didn't do it on purpose.
And Danny Zavala is joining us now to talk more about this. So first, I kind of want you to help us differentiate the difference between punitive damages versus compensatory damages and how you kind of come up with that.
Fortunately, the root of the word is in the name. Compensatory damages are intended to compensate a victim. But in Texas, as in most places, those are split into 2 categories. You have economic damages, and those would be your actual financial harm that the victim suffered. And then within that is pain and suffering, which is non-economic damages, which is always an exercise in subjectivity. But both those categories in compensatory damages are designed to compensate the victim. Punitive, on the other hand, again, the root is in the word, is designed to punish obviously not the victim, but the defendant for what they did. And again, an incredibly subjective process. And in fact, unless the jury tells us how they arrived at whatever they end up awarding, we may never know exactly what went into their calculus. But punitive damages, when they go back into that jury room, often is just a measure of how angry did this defendant make us and how infuriated are we. And the punitive damages award will reflect that. However, in Texas, there is a cap on punitive damages, which the jury will not know about while they deliberate.
So the parents in this case are suing for $150 million, right? $4.1 million awarded yesterday in compensatory damages, right? So we're looking today for these punitive damages, and I'm hearing now that the jury just came with a verdict, so we're waiting for those numbers to come in. But as we await that, Danny, and you think about what the attorneys laid out there and saying, listen, this guy's worth $270 million, right? Make this something that actually damages him, right? Actually punishes him for what he did. What are you expecting here?
I'm expecting a large damages award, probably one in excess of the Texas cap. But I'm expecting them with that kind of information, if they have competent evidence and they found that expert, that witness, to be credible, to award punitive damages in a significant amount. Because if they were watching the same trial I was watching, Alex Jones didn't acquit himself very well on the stand, whether he was apparently being caught in cross-examination with the whole phone debacle, turning over the texts and maybe withholding that information. Possibly, we don't know. And in general, it doesn't seem that he did a fantastic job on the stand. Plus, you have plaintiffs that are just so sympathetic. I mean, you don't get more sympathetic plaintiffs than this. I could see the jury really hitting him, even though comparatively, you could argue that $4 million for the compensatories was not a big number. Although, I might argue that it was when you consider that this is not a traditional personal injury case where somebody has a physical injury, they're missing an arm, or they have even a torn rotator cuff, or they have some other serious life-altering wound.
What do you make of the revelation of those text messages, the text message exchanges, all the information from Alex Jones's phone that were mistakenly sent to the attorneys of the Sandy Hook families that was then revealed in court? Is that going to cause any problems going forward, considering the fact that it seems as if Jones's attorneys at one point kind of emailed the Sandy Hook families and said, or the attorney for the Sandy Hook families and said, listen, sorry, mistake here. Right.
There are so many things going on with this. We don't have enough time, but I will run through them. Number one, the January 6th committee, that's the most obvious thing. They're going to be interested in that, and that has nothing to do with the trial. But as far as attorneys accidentally emailing information they shouldn't to the other side, there, but for the grace of God, go I, Yasmin.
I mean, I don't even, how does that even happen?
Because you start emailing stuff around. In the old days, a paralegal would prepare it, send it out, mail it out. Nowadays, we do it by PDF and email. So if you're moving too quickly, and you know how your email auto-populates a name, it could be John so-and-so, and instead you send it to John the enemy, John the bad guy on the opposing counsel's team. But here's the thing. Modern courts and the rules recognize that this happens. So Texas has a rule, a 10-day snapback provision, where from the day the attorney discovers that they made that mistake, not the day that they sent the mail or sent the document, from the day they actually discover they screwed up, then they have 10 days in which to say, hey, give me that back, which is, really in the digital era, you don't really give back the file, you delete it. But they had 10 days, and apparently, according to cross-examination that we heard, they let that 10 days expire. And then here's the part I really don't get. Okay, let's say they made a mistake.
Why would they let that 10 days expire, though, you think? Do you think they did it on purpose, or do you think that they let it expire because they didn't actually know that the email had been sent?
I have no idea. Maybe they thought it wasn't that big a deal. Maybe they didn't understand what they had turned over. Maybe they just ignored their email. I don't know. But then here's the second part, Yasmin. Let's say that they ignored that email or whatever and didn't care and let the phone data be turned over. Why didn't they tell their client? Because it looks like he got hit with a folding chair in cross-examination, a figurative folding chair. But it looked like he got walloped, that he had no idea that this data was out there and it was turned over. So one of two things. Either his attorneys didn't realize for some reason that they had turned over the phone and its data, or they just forgot to tell their client. I don't get it. There's more to the story here. We may never find out.
So we have like a 4-minute warning at this point. It seems as if we're going to be getting these numbers in and this verdict in. So I think it's best that we kind of talk through some of these things, because I think there's so much to talk through. One of which is this is the first of 3 cases that we're looking at, right? If they award, for instance, let's say they come back with a number of 100 million or something like that. This guy is possibly worth 270 million. When you're in a situation where you're awarding more than what this person actually has to give, what happens then?
What happens then is you get a judgment against that person, and then, good luck to you pursuing it. By the way, this is why in defamation cases, you usually don't see them in court. And when you do, it's usually only against somebody who's really rich. The reason for that is intentional torts like defamation are not covered by insurance. So they're not appetizing to lawyers like me who would want to file a lawsuit and go after that insurance money. The reality is most regular folks, you, me, guy on the street, we don't have assets to pay a $10 million judgment in a defamation case. And that's why you find, lawyers like me say, we get calls like this all the time. Hey, someone defamed me on Facebook. Yeah, but the thing is, they don't have money, and it didn't really cause you any harm.
Johnny Depp trial play out that way as well, because there was more money to play with in that situation.
I'm so glad you brought them up. They're a perfect example. We may never again see two high-profile defamation cases this close together, most of the time, defamation cases are passed on by lawyers. Unless you have somebody who's famous enough that they could have a real reputational harm that matters, and you have a defendant that has deep enough pockets. And that's why, for these intentional kind of torts, you really don't see what people going after individuals unless they're rich and famous and rich.
What did you make of this guy's intentions in watching his testimony?
Alex Jones?
Yeah.
All right. I am so perplexed.
Well, I say this because he said, well, in a way, his defense was, I was misled, right, by this misinformation, right? So I apologize. As if he was kind of passing the buck, right? But if you watch Alex Jones at all, if you've seen anything he has to put out there in InfoWars, right, I mean, he is the king of misinformation.
By the way,
this is his number one kind of objective in life, it seems.
When did putting your head in the sand become a viable defense? You see it in January 6th committee hearings. It's been working. Yeah, and it works. With Donald Trump, you get, and everybody in Donald Trump's circle believing all of these, theories, but you go back to someone like Alex Jones, whose defense is essentially, well, I mean, that's what I was told and that's what I believed. I actually believed I never intended to defame anyone. That's sort of what he was saying in his, on his show that we just showed, that clip that we had. So what is he thinking? I don't know. There's so many strategic choices here that are bizarre to me. Number one, they didn't fight the liability portion. This was a very rare thing where you saw a televised trial on just damages. That happens a lot, by the way. It's just not televised. The liability portion is the more interesting part. And Alex Jones basically said, oh, I'm liable. Let's just figure out how much I owe. He didn't actually say I'm liable. He let default be entered against him. That means he was a no-show. That means he got sued, he got served, and they essentially ignored it and failed to, a judge entered default against him.
At the end of the day, he was going to be held financially accountable, it seems.
I don't see it that way. I think the defensible part of the case would have been the liability portion. I think if they wanted to defend this case, they could have raised First Amendment protections. Yes, but any time you try to hold somebody liable criminally or civilly for what they say, there's always going to be a defense. Why? Because words are never the same, and even when they are, the context is key. No two defamation cases are ever the same because the words that we speak are capable of different interpretations. You have to look at the intent behind them. There are so many factors that made this, I wouldn't say a strong defensible case, but a defensible case. Certainly, I just can't recommend to anybody that they would say, hey, let default be entered against me. Consider, I lost. Now let's go figure out how much I have to pay. That doesn't seem like a viable strategy to me.
Do you think this is kind of a standalone case as the Amber Heard Johnny Depp case was, or do you think this is going to set precedent for defamation cases going forward, especially as we look at kind of political defamation? I mean, these high profile cases, misinformation. I mean, this isn't the first time we've seen something like this. But of course, you talk about the money involved. And by the way, what we haven't talked about is the emotion involved, right? The lives that were lost. These were babies. These were children. And the jury is certainly taking that into account, right? This isn't just about what he is and what he said and how much he's worth. This is also about the fact that these babies lost their lives. Yeah. And these parents had to live through a time in which this individual was going on the internet and saying they were actors and these children were never alive.
That's right. And that's why when juries go in and they're charged with figuring out punitive damages, and they really don't get a lot of guidance about. By the way, there really isn't anything to base punitives on other than, we know roughly how much he's worth. But really, as much as the judge admonished them, don't let your biases come in. Punitives are all about bias. You're going to go in there and they're going to say, how much do you hate that guy? Or how much did you find him credible? Now, keep in mind that for the compensatory damages, there were 10 out of 12 jurors who agreed on that verdict. I believe in Texas you need unanimity for the punitive damages. So, you might infer there are at least two holdouts that might have thought what he did wasn't so bad. So, we may see a dramatically different result with punitives. I think in likelihood, what the jury concluded was that the compensatory damages were relatively in the 4 million range instead of 100 million because of the absence of physical harm. That makes sense, maybe. But then when they get to punitives, maybe they're thinking that's where they're going to bang him.
That's where
But that is, the problem with that for the plaintiffs is that there is a damages cap on punitive damages in Texas. So $100 million verdict, most of that the plaintiffs would never see.
All right, we're going to continue to watch this, the Alex Jones trial. Danny, you're going to stick with me for a moment. We're going to take a quick break, and then we will be right back. All right, welcome back, everybody. We are on verdict watch with the Alex Jones trial, but we do want to pivot for a moment. It is the second day of CPAC, and some prominent speakers drilled down on fringe ideas and conspiracy theories, repeating unfounded claims of voter fraud in the 2020 election and going after the transgender community. Watch this.
If you see someone with a beard and chest hair and a voice like Barry White, that's a dude.
All right. So the convention also hosting Trump-backed candidates running in the 2022 midterms, like the GOP Senate nominee in Ohio, J.D. Vance, and the Republican candidate for Arizona governor, Kari Lake, receiving a standing ovation less than a day after her race was called. While Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene called Alex Jones politically persecuted, I should say. Gary Grumbach is joining me now to talk more about this. All right, Gary, you've been on the ground for all of this. Bless you. Give us a feel of what the convention has been like today.
Yeah, yesterday was much more about Trumpism and foreign and domestic Trumpism with the speech from Viktor Orban, the Hungarian president. Today is much more of a conspiratorial tone. They had an entire segment, a session about medical advice, very questionable medical advice as it relates to vaccines. We heard from Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, Andy Biggs, somebody who is a January 6th, anti-January 6th person. We're also hearing from elected officials like Senator Rick Scott, who painted a very dark picture of America, saying that it's turning into a militant left control of the economy, of the culture, and really of the entire country. He says this is not even a country he recognizes anymore. Senator Ted Cruz said some very similar things, had some colorful things to say about Democrats, and saying how the Democrats control the country and that there is the American free people that are going to take back this country. And it's not just the speakers on the stage that we're hearing this from. We're hearing this from folks, the attendees that live here, that are here for the conference as well. And it's fascinating because these people are so emotionally invested in all this. I had one woman crying to me because she felt like the country was going downhill so intensely. Yasmin.
Talk to me about the kind of the elephant in the room, which is the divide in the Republican Party that we all have been talking about for quite some time, right? The establishment versus the Trump arm, right? And it was kind of the split picture thing that we saw with former Vice President Mike Pence up against former President Donald Trump, backing two different candidates in the state of Arizona in the lead up to the primaries. What did folks there on the ground have to say about that?
Yeah, yes, CPAC has been, for years, the home for conservatives and conservatism. It's very much become, as you've mentioned, the home for Trumpism and Trump world. And that's very clear, both what we're hearing on stage and what we're hearing from attendees here at the conference. They are all in on Trump. They don't care about anybody else. Take a listen.
If Trump runs in 2024, would you vote for Donald Trump?
Yes, sir. Sure would. Sure would.
I would really like to see Ron DeSantis run.
If Donald Trump don't win, I'm going to pray that God will just end it.
Now, that was definitely a little bit dramatic on that woman's part, for sure. But there's also some speakers who aren't here, and I think that's notable, too, who's not here. Vice President Mike Pence is not here. Mike Pompeo, not here. Ron DeSantis, not here. Chris Christie, not here. All people who are certainly been in the conversation for 2024, putting a proverbial line in the sand between these folks and those. Yasmin?
All right, Gary Grumbach for us. Thank you, Gary. Be well. All right, want to get you over to the 5 things our team thinks you should know right about tonight. Number 1, Israeli forces unleashed airstrikes on Gaza Friday, saying they were targeting the Islamic Jihad militant group. Palestinian officials say at least 10 people were killed, including a senior militant and a 5-year-old girl. Dozens of others were hurt. Palestinian militants later launched their own rockets. Number 2, Texas Governor Greg Abbott says he started sending buses of migrants from his state to New York City. He says it's to give relief to Texas border towns. The first bus arrived today. Volunteers helped guide people who didn't have relatives nearby to city resources. New York City Mayor Eric Adams' spokesperson accuses the governor of using people as political pawns and called on D.C. for help. Number 3, a judge in Los Angeles has ordered Kevin Spacey and his production companies to pay nearly $31 million to the producers of the Netflix show House of Cards. It is for the losses brought on by Spacey's firing over sexual harassment allegations from crew members. Through his attorneys, Spacey has denied the allegations. Number 4, French environmentalists are working to save a seriously underweight beluga whale. They normally live near the Arctic, but this one has strayed into the Seine River, which does not have the right kind of food for belugas. Some conservationists think guiding it out of the river will not work, and they're pushing for it to be captured and flown back to its natural habitat. And then number 5, watch this. People in Iceland gathering to watch a volcanic eruption near the country's capital. Officials there say it's not a great idea, though, because of poisonous gases. The government says there's no immediate risk of damage to any big infrastructure. We'll be right back. All right, welcome back, everybody. We're following this breaking news with the verdict coming out of the Alex Jones trial, and we're talking about punitive damages here. Of course, the compensatory damages yesterday, they were issued to the family there that was suing Jones. This is one of 3 trials that we're going to be watching. Yesterday, the compensatory damages were, I believe, $4.1 million. We're now getting the verdict in for these punitive damages, in which the attorneys for the Sandy Hook families said, in fact, you should punish this guy. He is worth, it seems, upwards of $270 million. And we're hearing now on question 1, as I'm being told, they have issued $4.2 million in punitive damages, Danny Savalos. Question 2, $20.5 million. And then number 3 is $20.5 million as well. So we're looking at a total of punitive damages for this first trial being around, $44 million.
Right, but if they're doing it by counts, I don't know how many, there may be more counts than just those 3. So I don't know if they're finished reading the verdict yet, but so what they're saying is they're adding up, they're apparently dividing it by each count. If the answer to the first question is, what do you award on this count? What do you award on this count?
Yeah.
So we're seeing that those would be aggregated. So if you said 4 million, 20 million, and 20 million, we're looking at about 44 million, if that's the math that is coming in. And of course, we're just getting this in as we're talking here. So
so it's a total of $45.2 million in punitive damages for this lawsuit filed by the parents of Sandy Hook shooting victim Jesse Lewis.
Right. So your total is $44 million. Now, the interesting part is that Texas has a punitive damages cap. It's a bit of a complicated formula, but the bottom line is that the maximum that I believe they would have been entitled to, the plaintiffs, is doubling of the compensatory damages award. So that would get you to 8.2 plus $750,000. So at most, I believe the most they could have gotten is $8,750,000. So some of that might be overage that the plaintiffs will never see. And of course, I may have calculated my Texas punitive damages wrong. Not a Texas lawyer. Haven't dealt with that punitive damages rule. But the point is there is a cap, and it is a sliding scale, that cap. It depends, believe it or not, on the award of compensatory damages. It's a multiple of what the compensatory damages are. There was an interview yesterday with the plaintiff's attorney, and he was talking of the multiples. And I believe that's what he meant, is that the limit on your punitive damages depends on what you got for compensatory damages.
This is obviously something that the jury does not necessarily know. They have not been advised of.
They do not. And to me, I think the plaintiffs, the reason they were asking for such a big number is for nothing else than the symbolic value to hang that kind of verdict on Alex Jones, even if the punitive damages cap in Texas precludes them from ever actually recovering it. It is still a good number to hang on Alex Jones as a defendant in this case. So that may have been part of the strategy for asking for that kind of number. But again, even any of these numbers in punitive damages cases are different from compensatories, because the jury is not thinking about, they're not looking at medical bills or, trying to put a dollar value on an injury to a shoulder or a leg. They're going in the back room and saying, how angry are we?
How angry are we? That's literally the question that they're answering. Let's bring in David Henderson, who's been standing by for us as well, to just get some reaction on this verdict. David, talk to me. We're hearing now $45.2 million essentially in punitive damages here. That's in addition to yesterday's verdict of $4.1 in compensatory damages. What's your reaction?
Yasmin, that sends a huge message, which is what you hope for in this case, because regardless of how much families actually get to take home, these big verdicts do send a message. And I think they also help the family with closure. Danny hit the nail on the head, as usual, though, with regard to Texas law. We're a tort reform state, so we severely limit what families can actually take home. His math is correct. They get 2 times compensatory damages. And in addition to that, non-compensatory damages are capped at $750,000. And here's the way you think about that. Damages that you can show a receipt for, you multiply those by 2, then you add the damages you can't show a receipt for, like pain and suffering, but those are capped at $750. Basically, all of the damages in this case are pain and suffering damages. So the amount that he will actually pay in punitive damages, despite this $40+ million, he will pay $1.5 million, which shows how woefully inadequate our laws are.
Well, that's exactly right, because when you think about how much he's possibly worth, upwards of $270 million, and the pain that he caused these families because of the lies that he spread, and he's essentially just paying $1 million or so, that's a drop in the bucket for a guy like Alex Jones, even with 2 more trials ahead. He knows going into this, there's a cap to everything.
Yeah, the unfortunate truth here is that all of his antics, all of his offensive behavior, which the jury obviously rejected or they wouldn't have given this reward, based on the law, indicates that he won. That's right. The amount that he actually pays is minimal. And we need to ask ourselves some hard questions about why that type of result should be in place when the jury clearly wanted something different. And you have to remember, the jury is there to speak on behalf of the people. They're there to speak on behalf of all of us who clearly want a different result than what the law is going to allow for.
Danny, are there other caps in states outside of Texas, or is this kind of just more particular to the state of Texas?
Oh, yes. There are caps in lots of states. You most commonly see them in medical malpractice cases. And David is absolutely right. I mean, these caps, you usually see them in conservative states where they've tried to limit what they describe as runaway juries or runaway plaintiffs' attorneys. And look, I'm biased. I do plaintiffs' work. But you see, especially in med mal cases, in this case, it's harder to see because at its core, these like damages award.
Protections for corporations.
Of course, it's defendant protections for doctors, protections for corporations, defendants in general. It's a little harder to see the injustice here because at its core, this was always a difficult damages case to calculate. But you think about it in the med mal context, sometimes people need care for an injury that was caused to them by malpractice, and they need $100,000 worth of care every year. And when you look at it that way, $1 million cap, it doesn't seem like as much as it might to other folks. It might seem like a big dollar amount to the legislators who passed that law. But when you look at lifetime care costs, I mean, multi-millions. So these caps are illusory. They are not really, they're not helping regular folks. It's not about runaway juries. It's not about plaintiffs' attorneys getting rich. It really isn't. But then again, keep in mind, I'm biased because I actually practice a lot of plaintiffs' work.
David, it seems to me at the end of the day, this is really a message that the Sandy Hook families wanted to be sent, right? This obviously is not about money for them. I mean, this is about the children, the babies that they lost, and the emotional damage that they face, but also to send a message that you can't do this to people, right? Because they knew going in this cap existed. I'm sure they had been advised by their own attorneys this, in fact, was in place. And at the end of the day, he was not going to have to pay out a lot, no matter what the jury awarded them.
Yasmin, that's exactly right. And unfortunately, a big part of my experience as a lawyer involves dealing with parents in court who had something terrible happen to their child. Whenever you see that there's a big award, regardless of what people are going to take home, that reward is there, as we say at our firm, what's good for your life is bad for your case, what's bad for your case is good for your life. So these big numbers reflect these people went through a substantial amount of suffering because of what Jones did. And if you ask them, they'd rather none of this had ever happened.
Exactly.
And in that context, yes, this sends a very important message that the jury agreed with them. And again, since they speak on behalf of the people, what they state really should carry the day. And it's unfortunate here that it's not going to.
Again, I will restate, the jury has awarded Sandy Hook families that have sued Alex Jones in punitive damages a total of $45 million today. That is in addition to the 4.1 in compensatory damages yesterday. And this is the first of 3 cases we'll be watching with this. Danny and David, thank you both. Appreciate it. That wraps it up for me, everybody. We're going to have more for you here on Monday, same time, same place. Coverage picks up right now.